Welcome everyone to another Ask the Editor session. I am here today with Joshua Bohnsack, editor of TriQuarterly. I'm so excited to do this interview. Thank you so much, Joshua, for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much. Again, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and welcome to all of you. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat and I will work them into the conversation. My internet has been a little bit wonky, so if you see my video turn off, I'm still here. So don't panic. I'm just trying to save the bandwidth a little bit. So let's jump right in. So TriQuarterly has been around since the mid-50s. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the first issue, I think, was 1956. It was started just by grad students at Northwestern University, and then wasn't officially adopted into the university until like early 60s or so.
Okay. Do you know anything about the origin story? Like what was the impetus for starting the journal?
Yeah, not so much. I think it was just kind of like the standard, a few students were like, well, we can put a magazine together, and then just kind of did it. Yeah, so that I've tried to look into it, and there's just not very much information about it, where it's more just kind of like, yeah, they did this thing, and then it started growing, and
Right.
university adopted it. Yeah.
One sort of quirky fun fact is that I was looking at the first issue today and I noticed 3 people named Richard are in that first issue. Is that something that ever you guys talk about? Or is that just like a weird coincidence?
I've never noticed that. I've
Okay.
looked through the first issues and they're like quite homogenous.
Yeah, well, I was struck by that, and not only homogenous, but like identical names. So I thought that was pretty interesting. So when did you come on board for the magazine?
So I started reading for the magazine in 2016, 2017, around then, just as a fiction reader.
Okay.
Some of the editors were just like, you should get involved. And I was kind of like, I have too many projects going on. Like I was in grad school, I was
Right.
working full time, and pretty resistant. And then I was really glad I did, because it was a much needed relief.
Yeah. So tell us actually about that experience. So you started as a reader. What was that? What was that like?
Yeah, so essentially it was, we have about 5 fiction editors on staff.
Okay.
And every 2 weeks, like they'd assign me a new batch of reading. It was like, 15 submissions. If I got done with more than that, then they'd send me more, but it's just kind of like browsing those, giving our initial like ratings. We use a pretty simple like 1 to 5 scale.
Mm-hmm.
And just kind of reporting back on that. And then like every once in a while tagging the fiction editor and be like, hey, if you want to send me more stuff, I'd love to get some more.
Okay. And did you have any exciting discoveries when you were a reader?
I always wanted like one of the pieces I was going to read to be in the journal. Like,
yeah.
Who doesn't? But I kind of had that realization where I was like, there's a lot of things going on, and it is, a younger reader, or a younger writer,
Mm-hmm.
reading all these submissions. It might not have had like a large contribution to the magazine, but there was a high quality of, slush unsolicited submissions that we were getting. So it was like really cool to be like, help contribute to the quality of the magazine.
Sure, sure. So then tell us about your rise. So I guess there was an opening for an editor and then you applied, and how did that kind of work?
Yeah, so at the time it was primarily staffed by alumni and current grad students in Northwestern's School of Professional Studies MFA program for creative writing. I was kind of convinced. I was working for an indie publisher like based in Chicago at the time, and so I had experience with Submittable, and that was kind of the main thing. And like the editors liked the press that I was working with. And yeah, so I interviewed, and it was another thing where I'm like, oh, I don't really have time. But then like once I started doing it, it became like really a passion project, whereas like my day job at this indie press was work.
Okay. So what was it, sort of the community that made it more of a passion project? Was it actually the Lit Mag itself? Like what distinguished working at that other place from working on TriQuarterly?
Yeah, so it was definitely one of my goals, like when applying to grad school, is like I want to work with TriQuarterly. Then I got here, moved to Chicago. I was like, I don't know if I have time. I'm too busy. But I'd always respected the magazine for kind of its like ingenuity and like willingness to take on more experimental pieces, which I was reading a lot of lit mags at the time, and you know, even like 5-10 years ago, there was less risk involved, I think, than people are willing to do now. I like the fact that it was like an online magazine, so there was like more outlets for like our video essay section, things like that, like audio of like hearing that poets like read. So it felt like there was like a lot more stuff that I could take on, and like a lot more playfulness that I really enjoyed.
Okay, so let's cover the basics. So the magazine publishes fiction, poetry, nonfiction, and some other things you mentioned.
So in our typical issues, we do fiction, poetry, nonfiction, and video essays, which was kind of pioneered, I think, when we TriQuarterly relaunched in 2009 as an online publication. And it, you know, it was kind of an outlet where it's like, we're online, so we might as well use this world to like explore new medias. In addition to that, like outside of our normal 2 issues that we publish, those typical genres, throughout the year, we also do interviews and craft essays in our the latest word section.
Okay. That's really exciting. So what are the video essays? What does that entail?
Yeah, so it's a lot of like, you know, of course, like hybrid of visual and audio components. But there have been things like I say we, but this is, you know, well before my time, but like TriQuarterly is one of the first publications to publish one of Claudia Rankine's situation episodes from Citizen, where it has like those aspects where like you can't quite have it textually on the page, but like can see that action to it. And we get a fair share of them. It's interesting to sort through it because it's a lot less standard than the typical like writing submissions you get. Like you can see people really like playing with the experimentalism of this form.
Right. I guess the best way for people to learn about the form, if they don't know anything about it, would be to go to the site. And are these are all available on the site?
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, all of our video essays, all of our issues are, even our you know, 100 and so issues prior to going online are all digitized.
Okay, great. So it's interesting to hear you say that TriQuarterly is sort of an experimental magazine, because I don't think of it that way in my mind. I guess I'm thinking back to the print issues that I've read, and they didn't jump out at me as particularly experimental, but it's really exciting to see the magazine going in that direction. Is that something that the editors actively look for, or is it a mix of sort of more traditional work and experimental?
Yeah, I guess now that you know, I say it, like experimental probably isn't like the term, but it was a lot of like collaboration with like presses like Dalkey Archive Press and like FC2 Collective, where they use experimentalism as like this, you know, kind of catch-all term. Sorry, I live on a busy street, so there's a lot of other noise. But I think there are things where like it was pushing boundaries of form and style that like weren't always done at the time. And I would say with something that we kind of look for is stuff that, you know, it kind of strips away like the you know, elitism aspect of like what the name comes with, like being associated with Northwestern University. So we try to like, you know, take that down, but also like have those barriers out of the way. So it's more of like stuff that you might not otherwise see.
Can you talk more about that? That's really interesting. So the style of the work in the work that you curate and present, is there sort of a conscious effort to take away like the elitism affiliation with the university, and how does that, what does that look like?
So as I said earlier, we were primarily staffed by alumni and current students in the MFA program. And my direct predecessor, Aaron Majorum, you know, kind of stepped up and was like really took initiative with our faculty advisors and such. Was like, we need to get some like outside voices, you know, that aren't necessarily affiliated with the university on our staff. And so since then, we've opened up our readers to just kind of like anyone who wants to apply. And we've taken on some like really great editors who like weren't associated with the university. So it does like take away that like kind of air of pretension that I think
Right.
may have been there a little before. So that's, you know, I think the best way as far as like the work is concerned. Stuff I'm looking for, like I'm a sucker for anything that plays with like that form or like incorporates images in a way that's like really functional to the piece, which, you know, not all the fiction editors agree with me and are like more than happy to combat me about it, which I love. But like as soon as I see something that has like plays with that form, like what can be like textual versus like what's on the page and what the reader's experiencing, I'm all about it.
That's interesting. Can you give us sort of take us behind the scenes a little bit more and give us an example of a piece that you sort of went to battle over, and what was the, obviously you don't have to say specifics, but sort of what was the main issue over, like what were you defending and what were they kind of fighting against?
Yeah, so we take it, and granted, like they work a little different, like depending on the genre. So I'm going to speak mainly to the fiction editors aspect, where basically what we do is like we have our board, which is going to be an email system of like we'll send out a batch and be like, here's all these things, like everyone can like relay their thoughts and people kind of break it down, and then we try to give it like a hard yes, a hard no. And of course we get a lot of like, well, maybe leaning yes, or like maybe leaning no, but maybe yes. So it's you know, trying to put those like take away those variables and make it just like yes or no, which is very difficult. But there are a lot of pieces where just stylistically having, you know, 5 editors as well as the assistant managing editor and managing editor, that's 7 voices in a room trying to be like, you know, we take a pretty democratic approach to it, like on who gets what. But for example, like we're publishing a piece in the next issue, and it's a nonfiction piece from a writer named, I want to pronounce their name right, Annie Olgiano. And she had sent me pieces before, and it was a fiction piece I really loved. And, you know, the rest of the editors were just like, you know, it doesn't quite do it for me. Maybe it's not quite finished, established enough. Like it just needs a little more work that like we didn't have like the time or effort to put in the piece. And then she sent us this nonfiction essay that's like about Kafka's like wood planning manuals on like, so it's this piece on like essentially reflecting on how Kafka told people not to have, like cut their fingers off when doing woodwork, but it incorporates his like collage of like Kafka's visuals and then like Annie's pedagogical like strategy. So like it, you know, maybe that first round didn't go, but like sending it again, I was like, yeah, please send us more work. And then the nonfiction editors were like, yeah, this is what we're looking for.
So did you communicate that to her, that this was something that you really liked, but it just, that there was disagreement on the staff?
Yeah, I did. And we try to be, you know, pretty upfront about that. Like we do have them in our editors discussions. And like, I try to give as much personal feedback when like reaching out about submissions as possible as like I have the time for. I just know it's something I really appreciate like as a writer. So like if I can give that on, and people took the time to like find work that they think is suitable for like what we're interested in. So like what I really want to do is like kind of give that back to them of like, here's what I think, like here's what I would like to see more of if I have the time to do so. But yeah, so with her, I was kind of like, you know, like it got here, like I'm like, honestly, like I really like this piece. My editors found, you know, X, Y, and Z that needed to be done. And so I think she like took that into consideration when she was sending us new work.
So it sounds like the ideal submission for TriQuarterly right now for fiction would be inventive and plays with form. So if I have a character-driven, like sort of more traditional story, beginning, middle, and end, is it fair to say TriQuarterly is not the best home for it, or would you, you know, not want to rule it out?
always happy to see it, always happy to see those that are like
Mhm.
doing that successfully. But there's also like 1,000 other literary magazines that publish those and do like a really good job of curating those thematically. So yeah, send them it if you think it is doing those things, but maybe elevated form
Yeah.
wise or voice
Does
wise.
the focus is more on work that has a spirit of like inventiveness and kind of outside the box structure, maybe.
Right. I definitely
Yeah.
think so.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what are you seeing a lot of in submissions these days? Like what's out there? What's the trend? What are people writing about? What are they saying?
Interesting. I think just in general, there is this kind of step away from very like realist stories,
Mhm.
and just kind of speculating. Like I think maybe that trend is just like the way that like television culture has evolved.
Mm,
Like people realize that they need to do something else with the written word and with the page, like
mm,
really bring that like reader experience.
mhm,
Um, so we're seeing a lot of like I dare to call it like surrealism, or people are
mm.
like really diving into the absurd, where there's going to be a lot more situations that aren't, um, have that like Carver-esque
Yeah,
feeling to it,
right, right.
which I really appreciate.
Yeah, so less realism, you're seeing more kind of experimentation, speculative work.
Definitely. And I feel like people have been doing a lot of like really interesting things with time. Um,
Interesting.
so we don't have the straight like chronological linear structures anymore.
Yeah.
People are more willing to take risks,
Hmm.
and do so in a short story space, which I think is a fairly new structure that people are working with.
Hmm. So do you have any thoughts on what makes one of these more surreal or speculative stories like totally fail? Like if somebody who is starting out, if I wanted to say like, hey, I think I'm going to try some speculative writing, and are there kind of pitfalls I should watch out for?
From reading the submissions, it becomes very evident, uh, if it's a shtick versus if it's a tool that's working to convey the
Mhm.
story.
Yeah.
So you can tell where someone's just like, oh, I have this idea, and it's an idea versus it's a mechanism that makes the story work.
Mhm, mhm. So like a gimmick versus something that the story
Yeah,
maybe could
absolutely.
not be told in any other way.
Definitely.
That's interesting. Yeah, it's something for writers. I guess I don't know how writers would screen themselves for that, but maybe that's where you get readers to step in and look at your work outside of you. But yeah, just sort of asking yourself, like, I think writers should be asking themselves that all the time anyway. Like, why am I choosing this genre? Why am I choosing
Mm,
this form? Why am I telling the story in chronological time? Maybe it doesn't need to be told that way, and sort of interrogate like the purpose of how they're writing their work.
yeah, I completely agree with that.
Mhm. Yeah. Are you in the grad program now?
So I graduated a couple years ago.
Okay. So is this PhD or MFA?
This is an MFA.
Okay. In fiction.
Yep. And
And are you teaching as well?
so I currently teach. I adjunct at Roosevelt University, where I lead grad students in the creation of OYA literary magazine.
Oh yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, so you're doing two lit mags.
Yeah, so I do that, and I also co-run the small press, Long Day Press, with a few friends of mine.
Oh wow. Okay. So OYE, is it OYEZ? Is that the
Mhm.
yeah, okay. Oh cool. So that a student magazine?
It's student run. Like we
Mhm.
have work from wherever.
Mhm.
It's totally open submissions, which is coming up soon. But it's totally ran by the students, and it's a really fun process where it is like there aren't the limits or the constraints that might be there with TriQuarterly of like
Mhm.
trying to like establish this, where I feel like the students are into like very different things, and like again willing to take risks, and like willing to
Mhm.
like work with more like maybe even standard genre work.
Mm-hmm. Oh, this is cool. This is like a 2-for-1 interview. We could ask you about 2 magazines at one time. That's great. But going back to TriQuarterly, it is one of the premier lit mags in the country. Like, what do you think accounts for that? Like, what accounts for its amazing reputation?
Historically, it's just kind of always had that like echelon of there are like early poems by like Louise Gluck on there, and like it kind of adapted though, I think, to those writers who would have been bigger names in like more playful forms. So like a lot of the Dalkey Archive Press catalog, a lot of those writers were published in TriQuarterly before they had books out. And I think in more recent years, I want to give a shout out to Dane Hammond, who's on right now. Like I haven't spoken very much about our poetry side of it, but I think part of that is because it is such a well-oiled machine that the editors there just do a really great job of like, and have like such a good eye and such a good communication strategy of like what they want to publish, and that it's more or less like anytime like they bring work up to me and like, here's what we think, and I'm like, yes, you're absolutely right. So I think as far as like working with between genres, there is hopefully a consistency of quality that's always kind of been there.
And going back to the sort of elitism, I think that's a tension with some of these premier lit mags, is how do you bring in more people? So do you guys solicit work from established writers, or is it all like from the slush pile?
Yes, we do solicit work. I would say, I think maybe 30% of it is solicited work. And that's with the prose section. With poetry, it's a much lower number. It's a much higher slush submissions. And with that, like a lot of the times we do solicit work, it becomes from those writers that maybe in the past they've sent something and we're like, oh, this isn't quite right, you can send us something else directly. So the actual number of like more like established writers is going to be a lot smaller. Right.
So but you are getting work through the slush pile. So newer writers still have a chance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And like as a writer, like sometimes that's really frustrating to submit somewhere and be like, they're only gonna publish higher names, and it gets really it's frustrating. But I'm also trying to remember, like, magazines aren't there to serve those like submitting writers, they're there to serve their readers. But with TriQuarterly, I'm hoping we can do both.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, there is an argument that soliciting work actually benefits the newer writers in some way, because if your work is coming out in an issue with like big names, it's more likely to be purchased or read. So I think it's more of like a complicated issue.
Yeah, I love that. It's a really great point.
Yeah. So we talked about what you're seeing a lot of. What kind of stuff, is there anything you feel like you're seeing too much of? Like you just feel like, God, people are either in terms of subject matter or style or or certain tropes that you're seeing. Like there's just one of the editors was saying they just are really they've had enough of characters in a bar sort of thinking. So I'm curious if there's something that you're seeing, just you don't need to see any more of those particular things.
We see a lot of it's like the lyric essay has really come into the fiction realm as well. So there's that standard poet voice coming into prose pieces, and when it works, it works. When it doesn't, you see a lot of them that maybe quite don't.
Interesting. Can you say more about that? Like, what is it? How does that manifest?
There are times I'll be reading submissions and it will have this very like dreamy aesthetic, and then you realize it's maybe a more straightforward story that is having like incorporating a lot of language that doesn't need to be there really. And for this, sense of an online magazine where we really don't have readers' attention. Like it's very difficult to justify anything that's longer than 5,000 words online, because like you're reading it on a screen. So if we have the kind of those longer stories that are like more dreamy but aren't doing anything like or trying to take any kind of chances plot wise, it becomes evident real soon that you're just kind of reading this thing.
Yeah.
And there are other genres that are really great for that, and like sometimes it works, like I said, but like it's difficult to make it work really well.
Yeah, interesting. So are there any submissions that you get that you think do work really well and you really like them, but they're not a TriQuarterly piece?
Yeah, there are some, that we'll get occasionally that we might even really enjoy, but of course there's gonna be a thing where it's too similar to a piece that we already published, or it's doesn't really fit thematically. And that's also a hard thing too, when writers will be like, well, what's the theme that you're working towards? We don't know. They just kind of it just kind of happens where you find these pieces that are working really well together. Yeah, so that didn't quite answer your question, I don't think, but
yeah, I mean, well, it sounds like it's not, you won't, well, I don't know. It sounds like maybe you won't reject a piece because it doesn't fit with like the TriQuarterly brand or ethos. It's more about whether it works with the other pieces for a particular issue.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something like our editors have been very good about, being like, well, this piece is gonna like fit really well in the issue with this piece. And even there's something where like it works out even between genre editors if they don't know each other's pieces. Like my assistant managing editor, Kayla Udapata, and I have had like conversations where we're like, oh, these two pieces like really fit really well between genres, and there's something about it, like that aesthetic that just like clicks. But honestly, like we don't know what we're looking for until we see it.
Do you ever hold on to a piece for the next issue, like because you love it but you don't know how it's going to fit with what you have coming out?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially so last June we published the first themed, like straight themed piece that we have in a long time. Again, that was spearheaded by Aaron Majorum and Tara Stringfellow, who was was in our MFA cohort, and it was our Black Voices issue. So we had like some really great guest editors. Luther Hughes did poetry, and Andre Perry did nonfiction. Spring Ulmer did our video essay section. But of course, that meant like people who didn't fall into that qualification of Black writers weren't, couldn't be accepted for that issue. So like there are ones that we had to like hold on that maybe we accepted a year ago, but are just now going to come out in January.
And do you plan on doing more theme issues, or was that just like a one-off?
I would really like to. It's something that kind of fits in the history of the magazine, where if you look at issues from the 70s, 80s, there were a lot of progressive pieces that like weren't being published in America necessarily.
What do you mean?
They were like, there were certain theme issues that were like South American voices, or I don't want to say this incorrectly, but there was a certain issue for, I think it was Ghana, like voices from Ghana, or like ones from like the Ukraine, that weren't necessarily getting the traction in America in 76 literary circles.
So that's interesting. So the themes consistently focus on the writers, the voices from or voices of particular writers. That's like a sort of consistent theme focus.
Yeah, and the ethos was always kind of like TriQuarterly is a magazine of like world literature. And it's not that we've necessarily like gone away from that, because we do publish a lot of like international writers. But I think it hasn't been as much of a conscious effort in the last 15 years or so.
Is there work that you like decided like do not want to see? I know like all editor, they say they don't want to see excessive violence, sexism, racism, that's sort of like the standard. But is there something like you're just not interested in seeing XYZ?
For our video essays, we get a lot of like folks doing like straightforward readings.
Mhm.
And one of the things that I love about our poetry section is we offer the chance like for poets to record their voices. So I see this thing where people aren't like utilizing the video aspect of it, where we already have the audio component if the piece gets accepted as a poem. So I love to see more playfulness with the video aspect of that.
Mhm. Okay, good to know. And I'm curious, like, I always wonder this about lit mag editors, like, how do you decide, let's say how do you think about your role as sort of curating like a historical moment? And it seems like that is something the magazine thinks about in regards to the theme issue from last year. And so I'm curious, like, let's say you have two pieces and they're both great and you really like both of them. And one of them is just like, could take place at any particular time in history. And one of them is like about right now in the pandemic. Like, would you choose one over another because it speaks to like a particular, it's a historical record that you feel like the magazine like sort of has an obligation to to sort of keep, I'm really interested, especially now. I mean, there's always so much going on, but obviously like now there's so much going on. And I'm really interested in like how editors see their role. Are you only looking for like the best work, or are you also looking for work that sort of responds to our time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think a lot of the work just inherently reflects what's going on now, or even if it, if a piece is based in another time period, it's probably saying something about our current time. And that's not always true, but more or less inherently in the pieces that we accept. You asked me what I don't want to see any more of, and there are so many pandemic stories, essays, and you can. We found that we will take one of each, but like only if they're really great. So I was kind of like of this mindset where I'm like, I don't want to take any pandemic stuff. Then our poetry editor was like, here, I found this really great poem. And it was just this amazing, like the best response to the pandemic I've seen. And our nonfiction editor kind of did the same thing where she's like, here's this essay you need to read. And it's about like teaching students during the pandemic, which part of my day job is like working with students and like teaching writing programs to students. So it was something that just like really resonated, and I'm like, no one else has been able to say these things that I'm feeling in this way.
So it sounds like it doesn't, if the piece works, it's going to work. It doesn't necessarily, like, you don't feel like you have a sort of special responsibility to curate work that will show something about our time.
I don't think it's my goal. I think it happens. And that's the truth with, I think, any, if I find like a literary magazine and a used bookstore, I'm going to pick it up and I'm going to be like, just general, like, what was the literary movement like, and hopefully get a sense of that from whatever time period.
Right.
I have an old issue of Copper Nickel, and I want to be like, what were people writing in 1997?
Yeah.
Hopefully that will just give me a guide to it.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, it's sort of like inherent to the work. You can't get around it. You're writing about your time and, through your time, whether you even try to or not, to some degree.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So you're a writer as well, fiction writer, and are you sending your work out for publication?
Yeah. So I primarily write fiction and also essays occasionally. I try poetry, and then like realize I like reading it a lot more than I like writing it. So I have like a novel manuscript that I've kind of been sending out. I have short stories and essays that I've been sending out.
Mhm.
So it's been a task to like juggle between those, but I think honestly, like being able to like read submissions has helped me figure out like what I need to do for stories, or like what I like
Mm.
need to do to get another editor's attention.
Yeah. Can you give actually a little example?
Um, Cover letters.
Oh,
So
okay.
cover letters is like one of those things where like, as a rule, we try to like skim past it, go right to the story,
Mhm.
read the first. Generally, we try to read the first third of a story, see how it's going. It like if you can kind of guess the end, go to the end, and it's like that.
Mhm.
Then it's like probably a pass. But you also, it's hard to not see the cover letter when you're doing that. And there are a lot of people who there's kind of the classic trope of like telling me what the story's about, and it's like I don't
Yeah.
want to know what the story's about. I want to find out what the story's about. Or people who list 30,000 publications,
Yeah.
and maybe I don't know any of them, which
Right.
isn't to say like it's not reputable or like it's not within my wheelhouse.
Mhm.
But what I want to see is like what is in this work that you're sending me
Mhm.
specifically.
I'm just laughing because I'm still so surprised that people get the cover letter so wrong. Like it's the easiest thing. And it should take you, I mean, you just have a template. It should take you maybe like 10 minutes. And I teach writers about that. I mean, there's always some like existential drama about writing the cover letter, and it's just there's plenty of information out there about how to do it. It's so basic, and I think people overly complexify it. I don't know why, maybe because the thrill of having finished something and then you feel like you need to adorn it with this
That's fair.
magical I don't know, but it's just funny to hear you say that.
There's the Lincoln Michelle wrote a piece for BuzzFeed about like here's everything you know about literary magazines.
Mhm.
I think it came out in 2012, 2014. But it's like here's your template. And it's like,
Mhm.
dear editor, please consider X piece for publication,
Right,
your name, bio.
right, right.
Um, and that's the best. That's what I want to see.
Mhm.
I really want to encourage everyone to like put their email address in there, because like if we do want to accept it, I want to make it like as easy as possible for
Mhm.
to reach out to that person, like let them know you're accepting it.
You want to see the email in the cover letter? Isn't that part of the submittable, like, it's
It is,
automatic?
well, working on the back end of submittable is like it's possible, but there are so many extra hoops where it's like if you just put your email in there and like make it easy
Oh,
for editors.
okay, good to know. I actually didn't know that, so maybe I shouldn't laugh at people getting their cover letters wrong, because I didn't know that. But that's good to know. Yeah.
Yeah, like I mean, it's never really been an issue, but it's also like sometimes like tracking down writers to be like, hey, I really want to publish your piece. Like,
Yeah. So, but all that said, if somebody, spells your name wrong and they tell you, in 3 sentences, everything about their story, and they list 500 publication credits, all this stuff, you're still going to look at their story. And I think that's something that writers need to also